Module 2. Can't speak, won't speak. Children are unlikely to disclose they've been trafficked for a variety of reasons. Most are not even aware of what trafficking is, or they may believe they're coming to the UK for a better life, accepting that they may have entered the country illegally. They may be suffering from trauma, fear, intimidation and stigma, and most lack language skills. They may not remember what has happened to them, and they may give varying accounts. Disclosure from the child about their circumstances takes time and is often dependent on a relationship of trust and safety being established with them. Disclosure may be very limited where the child is within the control of a trafficker or facilitator, and can be especially difficult for sexually exploited children. When assessing the possibility of trafficking, considering indicators is often more practical than relying on the full disclosure from a child. Module 2. Case Study. Trong is from Vietnam. He was less than 15 years old when other Vietnamese boys told him they'd just returned from the UK. They told him that if he could get there, he could have a better life. They explained how good it was over there, and that as long as he was hard working, it would be easy for him to get a good job with a high salary. He might even be able to send money home. Soon after, he was introduced to a woman who said she would help get him into the UK. She would get him through the immigration checks by pretending to be his aunt, which she did. Trong was happy to be in England and excited that the two men who'd picked him up told him they were taking him straight to his new job. The two men and Trong drove for many hours through places he'd never heard of. Eventually, in the outskirts of a city where all the houses looked the same, they arrived at their final destination. The two men took Trong inside a house where he met another man. This man gave the two men who had delivered him some money, and they left. Even at this point, Trong did not realise he'd been trafficked. The house he was taken to for work was actually used as a cannabis farm. At the cannabis farm, Trong met other Vietnamese boys who told him they too had been sold to the farm owner and had to work off the money he paid for them. Some of the boys told Trong that they were able to wire money home to their family. One told him that he was paid £100 for 1 or 2 months of work at the Cannabis Factory. Trong worked there for a long time in exhausting conditions, and any time he questioned the boss, he'd be subject to verbal and physical abuse. Trong had never been enrolled in school in the UK. He was unable to speak English, so on the day the police raided the factory, Trong was unable to communicate and tell them he was being forced to work there against his will. Even if he could have spoken English, however, he would have been afraid of what might happen to him or his family. The boss at the cannabis farm had told him that the police and other authorities would put him in prison or send him back to Vietnam if he was caught. Trong did not trust anyone. The police could see that Trong was in bad health, and it was obvious that he'd been at the factory for a long time. It also quickly became apparent that he could not speak English. Trong was charged with the cultivation of cannabis and brought to the local authority's youth court. At court, a local authority youth offending team member was present and contacted the Children's Services Unaccompanied Minors team to express concerns that rather than being a criminal, this boy might in fact have been a victim of trafficking. In Trong's case, there were a number of indicators present suggesting that he may have been trafficked. His age, the fact that he was being exploited by being forced into a criminal enterprise, and he had been transported into the country and then from one location to another, where he was further exploited. And Trong was clearly in poor health and not cared for or educated. His case was referred to Sarah, a social worker in the Children's Services Unaccompanied Minors team. She worked hard to build his trust, and over time their rapport grew. They communicated using a translator. It took a long time, but Trong built his trust in Sarah and began to tell her his story. He told her how he was offered food and accommodation in return for which he was expected to work in cannabis factories looking after the plants. Sarah listened to how Trong's boss communicated with and controlled him by using a mobile phone he had given him, how he was moved from house to house, and how on one occasion, when Trong refused to move between houses, the boss held his face over the bars of an old electric fire. The scars from this untreated injury were still clearly visible. At a very early stage, long before Trong reluctantly began to tell his story, Sarah had decided that enough indicators were present to contact all of the potential agencies involved. She engaged the Crown Prosecution Service, the arresting police officers, the local authorities' youth offending team, and health services. Other inquiries were made with the UK Border Agency and the National Register of Unaccompanied Children database. No trace of Trong could be found on any system. When he was charged with the cultivation of cannabis, Trong pleaded not guilty. Bail was not granted, however, and he was remanded in custody at the Young Offenders Institution until his trial. During this time, an assessment was carried out. This process meant that all the agencies shared the information they had and were able to develop a more informed understanding of his situation. Through the supportive engagement and intervention of the youth offender and unaccompanied minors teams, Trong started to realise that he was a victim of crime. He was able to see more clearly that the people he'd been taught to fear in the past were in fact those people who were trying to help him. The child trafficking assessment confirmed he was a victim of trafficking, and this assessment was submitted to the UK Human Trafficking Centre competent authority, and then at Trong's court hearing. The charges against him were dropped and he was released into the care of the local authority. Trong was then placed with foster carers who'd been specially trained to look after young people suspected or confirmed as child victims of trafficking. The foster carers were provided with ongoing direct support from the child trafficking team and allocated a social worker. While on a visit to the dentist, Trong disappeared. In this case, the police and social services maintained contact. They wanted to ensure that any new information linked to his whereabouts could be quickly shared. They regularly checked for sightings of Trong and encouraged members of the public to check the Missing Kids UK website for further information. 18 months after Trong went missing from care, the UK Border Agency informed the unaccompanied minors team that they believed he had made an asylum claim under a false name. A joint investigation resulted in Trong being returned to care. Trong remains with his foster carers and is safe at this time. Let's consider the opportunities for intervention. Whilst this is a composite case study with a relatively happy ending, the facts are taken from real cases. Many children are never found, and some are so afraid of their traffickers that they return to them when told to do so. Early intervention is key. Early identification of indicators and an understanding of the fact that children can be so intimidated that they cannot speak or won't, as much for fear of authority as a threat of violence and intimidation. The Cannabis Factory was in an ordinary street, surrounded by ordinary people living normal lives. Trong could not speak English, was isolated and suffered horrible facial injuries that were never treated, and he was never noticed. When initially recovered, he may well have been further criminalised. He was remanded in custody and perhaps that kept him safe. In this case, the agency shared their information, and after a balanced assessment, he was released into a caring foster home. The fact is that the impact and trauma suffered during captivity and enslavement has a lasting impact. He was re-engaged by his traffickers and returned to a life none of us would choose. For 18 months, he was missing. His picture was on view on the Missing Kids UK website, but he remained invisible. We only see them when we know what to look for and actually look for them. Most people don't think about trafficked children. They're invisible but walk our streets every day. Have you ever looked at the Missing Children's website? Because trafficked children are exactly that, missing kids.